Hey everyone, how's it going? Today I would like to do a little chat about How It Is by Samuel Beckett. How It Is a novel that was published in English in 1961. It's one of my favorite books of all time. This is my second time reading it. Samuel Beckett is my favorite writer, so I am very biased. I would say that my feelings about the book are not very objective because of my feelings about Samuel Beckett. But if you have read the book, or if you choose to read the book, I am guessing that it is or will be one of the strangest books you'll ever read. And so I'm going to tell you what happens in the novel. I'm going to tell you what happens over the course of the entire novel. And before you turn away, because that's spoilers, I will just say that this is not a story where spoilers are important. This is not a plot-based book at all. And I don't even mean that in the usual sense when people talk about literary fiction or something as not being plot-driven, but there are still events that happen usually. And How It Is, there's pretty much no plot at all. And so I'm going to reveal what happens. If you don't want to hear that, despite what I've just said, then I will leave a timestamp for you to skip the spoiler part of this discussion. But anyway, without further ado, I will get into the plot. So, this novel is divided into 3 parts. It's about an unnamed narrator who is crawling through an endless wasteland of mud and probably also human feces. And he has a bag full of cans of food with him to keep him sustained, and he has a can opener as well. And he's just crawling through this endless wasteland, and eventually, when part 2 begins, he finds a man named Pym. And this man named Pym is also just lying there in the mud, and the narrator basically torments him for a time. He pokes him with his can opener, he slaps him on the butt, he pats him on the head, he claws him under the armpit, but the narrator torments this man named Pym for a time. And then in the 3rd part, Pym leaves, Pym starts to move on, and the narrator is left lying still, just like Pym was at the beginning of part 2. And the narrator is left hoping, wondering if someone will come to torment him, and that will begin a cycle. He hopes that this will begin a sort of cycle, that someone will come to torment him, and then after he's been tormented, he will go and start moving again to find Pym again, really. And so that's the story of How It Is. That is what this novel is about, to the extent that it's about much of anything. And so it's a very unusual story, but it's not only unusual in what happens, it's also unusual in the way that it's told. So it is written without any punctuation in the writing, without really even any kind of conventional sentence structure. You get the sense that the writing is done in fragmentary thoughts more than it is done in sentences. And so it's a little bit evocative of the kind of stream of consciousness style of James Joyce. Although I would say that this version of stream of consciousness is actually a bit more true to how people actually think. When we think of stream of consciousness, we think that's how people actually think. We think they think in a sort of Joycean tumble where it's one long sentence without punctuation and it just goes on and on and on from statement to statement. But really, I think most of us actually think in sort of fragments, little fragments. And so that's how It Is written. And those fragments are arranged into kind of paragraphs, you maybe can call them, but you maybe can see that there are no capitalized words, no periods, no sentences or anything, but they are arranged into paragraphs or maybe verses, you might call them. And I'll read you this opening passage just so you can get a little bit of a flavor of what this book is written like. So here's the opening. How it was, I quote, before Pym, with Pym, after Pym. How it is, 3 parts. I say it as I hear it. Voice once without, qua qua, on all sides, then in me, when the panting stops. Tell me again, finish telling me. Invocation. Past moments, old dreams, back again, or fresh, like those that pass. Or things always, and memories, I say them as I hear them, murmur them in the mud. In me, that were without, when the panting stops, scraps of an ancient voice in me, not mine. My life, last state, last version, ill said, ill heard, ill recaptured, ill murmured, in the mud, brief moments of the lower face, losses everywhere. So that's kind of an example of how this is written. And what's one thing that's interesting about this writing style is that it creates some ambiguities in what's actually being said, what the narrator means. So one point where that really stuck out to me is an example from the first part, and I'll read you the statement that I'm referring to here. So the statement or verse or paragraph or whatever you want to call it here is this. I'm often happy, God knows, but never more than at this instant, never so. Oh, I know happiness, unhappiness I know, but there's no harm mentioning it. And the reason that I bring this up as an example is because when you look at God knows at the very beginning of the statement, you can see that as just making a remark, right? Like we all say, oh, God knows so-and-so. We don't say it because we actually think there's a God out there who knows something specific. We're just using it to make a remark. And the narrator could easily be using it in that sense. But because of the lack of punctuation and the difficulty of knowing where to put the emphasis, he could also be saying, I'm often happy, God knows something. We don't know what the something is, but he could be saying that. And so this style of writing creates some ambiguities in what's even being said throughout the book. And that's one of the really interesting parts of reading this book, because you can kind of pick apart every verse endlessly, right? You can put words together in different ways, put emphases in different places, imagine punctuation in different places, and create different meanings out of it. And that is such a fascinating aspect of reading the book, and why I find reading this novel so very stimulating. Another comparison that a friend of mine who read this book made that I think is really interesting, another thing you can compare this writing style to is to the 12-tone method of composing music. So I'm not an expert in music, so take everything I say with a bit of a grain of salt, but in conventional musical composition, in Western tonal tradition, you have a key signature that comes from a single note in the 12-tone scale, and a piece of music will use a single key and the single note that key is based on as the kind of home key. So when you feel a sort of release in a piece of music, it tends to mean that you're hearing the home key or something. And so traditional Western music is based on the sort of centering of a piece of music around a specific note. But in 12-tone composing, you just take the 12 tones on the scale, and you compose the music so that no one of those notes is emphasized any more than any of the others. So there's not that feeling of coming home in music. And so 12-tone music tends to sound very unsettling and dark, and a lot of people don't like it for that reason. But I think that this style of writing can kind of be compared to that, because in a similar way to how you don't know where to put the emphasis in the music, in 12-tone music, there's no emphasis on one note, you don't know where to put the emphasis on in these sentences. So I think that's a very interesting point of comparison. And another, I think, stepping back a little bit more to just look at the story overall, I think the 12-tone comparison is also interesting because, again, in the 12-tone method, you do not emphasize any one of the notes any more than the others. None of them is any more important than any of the others, right, in 12-tone music. And in this story, in the story of How It Is, we see the narrator try to make sense of this world he's in, right? Because it's insane, right? Like, why is he doing this? Why is the world covered in mud? Where did these sacks of food come from? Were they put here by a god? Who knows? He's trying to make sense of it. And he tries to make sense of it through a sort of system that he thinks of. I sort of alluded to it at the beginning of this video, that he hopes that there's going to be this cycle, right? That after Pym leaves him in part 3, he hopes that eventually someone else will come find him torment him, and then he will be able to start moving again, and he will find Pym again, in a kind of endless cycle. And he tries to impose this structure on the world, and you see him grappling with that for much of the third part of the book. And so he's trying to put this structure on the world, put this meaning in the world, I suppose. You can see it as ritualistic in a way, and rituals are nothing if not supposed to provide some kind of meaning. But that contrasts with the way that it's written, right? Because again, you don't know where to put the emphasis. And the narrator wants to have emphases in places. He wants to have that meaning imposed. But the language does not impose it, in the similar way to how the 12-tone method of composition does not impose any importance on any one note. So I hope that makes sense. But I think it's a really fascinating novel just on the level of the sentence. Again, such as there are sentences in this book. And the way that I see this book, the way that I've seen it since I first read it, and the way that I see it this time is as basically a parable about human life. Samuel Beckett, as well as a lot of 20th century writers, it seems, is very good at creating absurd situations. Like in Waiting for Godot, you have two men standing next to a tree, waiting for this guy named Godot to show up, but he never shows up, and that's the play. You have Endgame, but so on and so forth. He's good at creating these situations that seem outlandish and insane when you first look at them, or when you look at them on paper. But if you think about them, you can see them as meditations on human existence. You can see them as equating our own existence to this existence. So we may look at how it is and think, well, that's insane. But I think what Beckett invites us to do is to see the story of this narrator as perhaps more similar to our own existence than we might like. So that's how I see it. I don't know quite what the novel says. I think it says something extremely profound about human existence. But again, I don't pretend to know what that is. But I do see it as a kind of testament to a really powerful form of nihilism, I think. This form of nihilism where you see that the world is probably meaningless, but somehow accept it anyway and move on. So anyway, that's how it is. If you've read this book, I would love to chat about it. I've met so few people who've read this book, and I really need people to talk to it about. So if you've read How It Is, let me know in the comments, give me your thoughts, and we can have a conversation about it. I don't mind if you didn't like it. I could see this as a novel that very much appeals to my taste and may not appeal to everyone else's tastes. So even if you didn't like it, let's have a conversation about it, please. So anyway, that is how it is. I hope my video made some sense, and I will leave it at that, and talk to you all later. Bye.